On a sweltering June day in 1694, as the sun beat down on the eastern borderlands of Poland, 400 men stared death in the face. Before them stretched a sea of humanity. 40,000 Tatar raiders, their curved sabers glinting in the sunlight, their battle cries echoing across the plains of Podolia. Colonel Konstanty Zahorowski, commander of this small band of Polish cavalrymen, knew the math was simple and brutal. Each of his men would need to fight off 100 enemies to survive. What followed was not just a battle, but an impossibility made flesh. A desperate stand that would become legend, where Polish ingenuity, courage, and sheer stubbornness would transform certain doom into one of history's most lopsided victories. The first warning came not with thunder, but with ash. On June 4th, 1694, a breathless scout galloped into the garrison at Okopie, Świętej Trójcy, his horse lathered with sweat. He had ridden straight through the night from the southeastern steppe, where columns of black smoke now punctuated the horizon. Villages were burning. Colonel Konstanty Zahorowski, veteran of a dozen frontier skirmishes, felt a familiar tightness in his chest as the scout described what he had witnessed. Not the usual raiding party of a few hundred Tatars, but something far more ominous. Thousands upon thousands of horsemen were sweeping across Podolia like a storm tide. Zahorowski knew immediately what this meant. Khan Selim Moghirai, the shrewd ruler of the Crimean Khanate, had launched the massive raid that intelligence had hinted at for weeks. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's eastern frontier lay dangerously exposed. King Augustus II's main forces were positioned far to the north, leaving the borderlands defended by only scattered garrisons. In his quarters that night, by lamplight, Zahorowski pored over maps and dispatches, calculating distances and timing. The numbers were grim. The nearest substantial reinforcements were days away. Yet every hour meant more villages razed, more civilians taken as slaves for Ottoman markets. As dawn broke, he made his decision. He would not wait for the horde to come to him. He would intercept them with whatever force he could muster. By noon, runners had spread his orders to nearby outposts. Assemble at Okopie within 24 hours, prepared for immediate action. All told, he would have 400 cavalrymen. Elite fighters, yes, but a mere droplet against the Tatar ocean rolling toward them. Dawn broke over Okopie Świętej Trójcy as the assembled cavalry formed ranks in the fortress courtyard. These weren't ordinary soldiers, but the elite of Poland's borderland defenders. In the front row stood 80 Hussaria, the famed winged Hussars, resplendent in their gleaming breastplates and shoulder frames that once held the iconic eagle feathers, now removed for practical combat. Behind them formed the panzerni, medium cavalry in mail armor, their experience in steppe warfare evident in their weathered faces. Zahorowski surveyed his force with a calculating eye. 400 men total, a mere fraction of what they would face, but quality over quantity had saved Poland before. "Gentlemen," Zahorowski addressed them, his voice carrying across the courtyard, "what we lack in numbers, we make up for in steel and spirit." At his side stood Major Stanisław Żaboklicki, a veteran of 20 years of frontier fighting, and Captain Mikołaj Bułajowski, whose tactical cunning had saved countless villages from Tatar raids. Most of these men had fought together before, at Kamieniec, at Żłaniec, along the Dniester. Their horses were steppe-bred, accustomed to the punishing terrain. Their weapons represented the height of European military technology: wheellock pistols, sabers of Damascus steel, and carbines that outranged Tatar composite bows. As they mounted up and rode east toward the reported Tatar advance, the differences among these men, nobles and commoners, veterans and fresh recruits, faded before their shared purpose. They had emerged from farming villages, from merchant families in Lwów and Krakow, from old Szlachta estates in Lithuania and Mazovia. Now they were simply Poland's sword, forged in previous conflicts and about to face its greatest test. The columns snaked through the morning mist, 400 riders bound by an unspoken understanding. Many would not see tomorrow's sunrise, but Poland's borderlands would not fall without a fight. Khan Selim, where Giray had led the Crimean Khanate through 2 decades of war and intrigue, earning his reputation as one of the most formidable leaders the steppe had ever produced. Now, astride his white stallion at the center of his massive force, he watched his advance units return with reports of Polish movement. The Khan's weathered face, framed by a steel helmet inlaid with gold, betrayed no emotion. This raid was different from the countless others he had launched against Polish territories. This one needed to inflict a wound so deep that the Commonwealth would bleed for years. Sultan Mustafa II had been explicit: disrupt the Polish frontier, enough to prevent any reinforcements reaching the Ottomans' Hungarian campaigns. Around Selim spread his army, not the regular Ottoman forces, but the legendary Crimean light cavalry that had terrorized Eastern Europe for centuries. 40,000 riders moved as a living organism across the steppe, divided into precise formations of Tumen and Alay. Their arsenal was deceptively simple, but devastatingly effective. Recurve composite bows that could punch through armor at 200 paces, light javelins for closer work, and the dreaded curved sabers for the final slash of combat. Unlike European armies with their cumbersome supply trains, the Tatars traveled light. Each man carried dried meat, parched grain, and kumis in leather pouches. Their horses were small but indefatigable, bred for the endless plains. As the crimson summer sun began to set, Khan Selim I summoned his commanders. Intelligence had pinpointed a small Polish force moving to intercept them, a suicidal gesture that brought a rare smile to the Khan's face. Tomorrow they would swallow these Poles whole, then continue their sweep through Podolia, unimpeded. The real prize awaited: the wealthy towns beyond the frontier, ripe for plunder, and thousands of Polish villagers who would fetch handsome prices in the slave markets of Kaffa. Colonel Zahorowski's scouts returned at dawn with grim intelligence. The main Tatar force was moving faster than anticipated, already having swept through 3 villages along the Siret River. Smoke columns on the horizon confirmed the worst. They were burning everything in their path. Zahorowski called an immediate council with Żaboklicki and Bułajowski, unfurling his worn leather map across his saddle. "We've lost the race to the river crossing," he admitted, tracing the Tatars' projected movement. "At their current pace, they'll reach Podhajce by nightfall." The implications were clear: thousands more civilians in the path of destruction, unless they could somehow divert the horde's attention. Bułajowski, ever the tactician, pointed to a small hamlet marked on the map. "Hodów. It lies directly between us and them, barely 3 hours' hard ride." What made Hodów significant wasn't the village itself, but what surrounded it. A substantial wooden stockade enclosure where local villagers corralled livestock during peaceful times. As the Polish force rode at breakneck speed across the rolling steppe, the summer heat rose mercilessly. Men loosened armor straps as sweat poured down their backs, yet none complained. They reached Hodów shortly past midday to find it abandoned, its inhabitants having fled before the approaching storm. The stockade stood as Bułajowski had remembered it, a roughly circular wooden wall some 10 feet high, enclosing nearly an acre. As the cavalrymen dismounted to inspect their potential fortress, a distant dust cloud appeared on the eastern horizon. The vanguard of Khan Selim's army had arrived sooner than expected. The time for deliberation had ended. "Secure the gates," Zahorowski ordered, his voice unnaturally calm. "Distribute ammunition. Position the horses at the center." 400 men prepared to meet 40,000. The stockade at Hodów had not been built for war. Erected by local farmers to protect livestock from wolves and petty bandits, its wooden palisade now stood as the only barrier between 400 Polish cavalrymen and annihilation. Zahorowski wasted no time. Bułajowski strengthened the main gate. Double the timber bracings. He turned to Żaboklicki. "Position our best marksmen at 20-pace intervals along the perimeter. We need interlocking fields of fire." The men worked with frantic efficiency, using their sabers to dig shallow trenches inside the wall, piling dirt and stones to create firing platforms. They tethered their horses in the center, 400 mounts that would become both their potential escape and their last resort for food and water if the siege dragged on. Outside the walls, the steppe had begun to transform. What had been empty grassland now filled with dark, moving shapes. First hundreds, then thousands of Tatar riders materializing from the horizon like a mirage made flesh. Through gaps in the palisade, Polish veterans watched with grim fascination as the enormous force continued to arrive, squadron after squadron spreading across the plain until they surrounded Hodów completely. Captain Bułajowski, who had fought Tatars since boyhood, felt his mouth go dry at the sight. "There must be 10,000, he muttered. A grizzled sergeant beside him gave a hollow laugh. "Double that, Captain, and more still coming." As the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, an eerie silence fell. Then, from beyond the wooden walls came a singular sound, the methodical beating of drums, growing in volume as Khan Selim's personal standard appeared at the front of the horde. The message was unmistakable. Surrender now or be obliterated. Zahorowski gathered his officers in the center of the enclosure. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "today we make history, or we become it." The attack came without warning. No battle cry, no ceremonial charge, just a sudden surge of 5,000 Tatar horsemen galloping toward the stockade from all directions. Their recurved bows sang as arrows arced overhead, darkening the sky like a sudden storm cloud. "Hold fire!" Zahorowski commanded, his voice cutting through the whistling of incoming projectiles. The Polish defenders crouched behind their makeshift parapets, arrows thudding into wood all around them. Zahorowski waited until the first wave closed to 200 paces. "First rank, fire!" The coordinated volley of 80 carbines erupted along the northern wall, the heavy lead balls tearing through the unarmored Tatar front line. Horses tumbled, riders flew from saddles, but the wave kept coming. As the Tatars closed to within 50 paces, the full Polish firepower revealed itself. Staggered volleys from each section of the wall, one group firing while others reloaded. The disciplined Polish gunnery exacted a terrible toll, but the mathematics of the situation remained inexorable. For every 10 Tatars that fell, another 100 pressed forward. The first wave broke against the wooden walls, like water against stone. Tatar warriors attempting to scale the palisade with grappling hooks and makeshift ladders. Hand-to-hand combat erupted along the perimeter, sabers flashing, pistols firing at point-blank range, men grunting and dying on both sides of the wall. Bułajowski led a desperate counterattack at the eastern corner, where Tatars had gained a foothold, personally cutting down 3 attackers before driving the rest back. As the first assault receded, leaving hundreds of Tatar, dead and wounded, scattered around the stockade, Zahorowski moved quickly among his men, redistributing ammunition and assessing casualties. They had lost 17 men, with another 24 wounded. The Poles knew what the Tatars were now discovering. This would be no quick victory, but a grinding battle of attrition where even overwhelming numbers faced the terrible efficiency of European firearms and Polish determination. Khan Selim. I watched the first assault shatter against the wooden walls with cold calculation rather than anger. The fortified position was stronger than his scouts had reported, and these were clearly not ordinary Polish troops, but frontier veterans. From his command position atop a small rise, he summoned his sub-commanders. "We will test each section of their perimeter," he ordered, pointing to the stockade with his ornate command baton. "Attack in waves, from different directions. Find their weakness." The Khan understood the psychological impact of unrelenting pressure. Even the most disciplined defenders would eventually crack if given no respite. The second Tatar assault came as a series of coordinated hammer blows. 3,000 riders striking the eastern wall, followed by 4,000 at the southern edge, then another wave from the west. Inside the stockade, Zahorowski and his officers rushed reinforcements from one threatened sector to another, their movements growing increasingly desperate as the afternoon wore on. The Polish cavalry carbines, devastatingly effective at the battle's outset, now faced a troubling limitation: dwindling ammunition. Each defender had carried perhaps 40 rounds, and many were now down to their last 10. The continuous Tatar pressure had achieved its first objective, forcing the Poles to expend their firepower. When a section of the northern wall momentarily buckled under a concentrated Tatar charge, Zhaboklitsky led a desperate counterattack, 20 Hussars abandoning their firing positions to engage in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The breach was sealed, but at terrible cost. 8 Polish dead, including a veteran lieutenant who had survived a dozen previous frontier battles. As the sun began its western descent, the wooden walls of Hodów now displayed a grim decoration. Hundreds of Tatar arrows embedded in the timber, each one a reminder of the overwhelming force gathered outside. "We're down to our last crates," Bułajowski reported grimly, his face streaked with gunpowder and sweat as he met Zahorowski in the center of the stockade. "Perhaps 10 rounds per man." The colonel nodded, surveying the battlefield through a gap in the palisade. The Tatar dead numbered in the hundreds now, but Khan Selim's seemingly inexhaustible force continued to press from all sides. Without ammunition, the Polish carbines, their greatest advantage, would become little more than expensive clubs. As the officers contemplated their dwindling options, a young cavalryman approached, clutching something in his hand. "Sir," he addressed Zahorowski, "I've been collecting these." He opened his palm to reveal a handful of Tatar arrows that had sailed over the walls. Zahorowski stared at the arrows for a moment before a slow smile spread across his weathered face. "Bułajowski, gather every able man not currently on the firing line. Have them collect every Tatar arrow they can find." Within minutes, a new operation was underway inside the stockade. Men gathered arrows by the armful, bringing them to a central collection point where others worked frantically to modify them. The Tatar arrows, lighter and smaller than European bolts, weren't designed for Polish weapons, but necessity had always been the mother of invention on the frontier. The defenders trimmed fletching, adjusted shafts, and repurposed the deadly projectiles to fit their own weapons. As the next Tatar wave approached, Khan Selim watched with growing confusion. Despite hours of continuous combat, the Polish defenders erupted with a surprising volley of fresh fire. What the Khan couldn't comprehend from his vantage point was the ultimate irony unfolding before him. His own warriors were now being cut down by their own arrows, fired back with deadly accuracy from Polish weapons. Inside the stockade, Zahorowski allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. They had transformed their greatest weakness into renewed strength, bought precious hours and delivered a psychological blow to their attackers. The tide hadn't turned, but at least now they would make the Tatars pay for every inch with their own weapons. By late afternoon, the stockade at Hodów had become a vision of hell. The ground inside was littered with spent casings, broken arrows, and the wounded who could no longer stand. Thirst had become as deadly an enemy as the Tatars. The summer heat and constant exertion leaving men's throats parched and voices reduced to rasps. The only water source was a small spring in the center of the enclosure, now muddy and fouled. Sergeant Miko Podbipięta, a 20-year veteran of the frontier wars, had continued fighting despite an arrow that had pierced his left shoulder. When he finally collapsed from blood loss, 2 younger cavalrymen dragged him to the makeshift field hospital in the center, where a former battlefield surgeon worked frantically to save those he could. Outside, Khan Selim had changed tactics again. Rather than costly direct assaults, he now kept constant pressure on the defenders with smaller probing attacks and a continuous rain of arrows. The psychological warfare was as calculated as it was effective. The defenders couldn't rest, couldn't lower their guard for even a moment. This was the Tatar way of war. Wear down the enemy until exhaustion claimed them. Inside the stockade, Zahorowski knew the grim mathematics they faced. They had lost nearly 60 men dead, with another 80 too wounded to fight effectively. Their remaining ammunition, even with the repurposed Tatar arrows, would last perhaps 2 more hours at most. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the colonel gathered his remaining officers. Their faces were blackened with gunpowder, their eyes hollow from hours of continuous combat. "Gentlemen," Zahorowski said, his voice barely above a whisper to preserve his parched throat, "our options are simple. We can attempt to break out at nightfall, a desperate gamble that might save some of us, or we stand and fight until the end." Captain Bułajowski, blood caked on his saber arm from a Tatar blade that had slipped past his guard, straightened his back. "We stand, Colonel. Poland expects nothing less." As twilight descended over the blood-soaked fields around Hodów, Khan Selim then faced a reality he had never encountered in decades of warfare. His massive force had suffered nearly 2,000 casualties, men who would never return to their families in Crimea. Yet the stubborn Polish defenders still held their ground behind the battered stockade. The Khan summoned his closest advisors, their expressions grim in the fading light. Reports indicated that his men were growing restless, unsettled by the unexpected resistance and their mounting losses. What had begun as a certain victory had transformed into a costly engagement with no end in sight. More troubling were the distant dust clouds spotted by scouts to the west, potential Polish reinforcements from Okopy Święty Trójcy, perhaps even a larger Commonwealth force. Inside the stockade, the defenders had reached the limits of human endurance. Men fought with wounds that would have hospitalized them in any other circumstance, passing weapons between them as others collapsed from exhaustion. Zahorowski himself had taken command of a section of the western wall when its lieutenant fell, firing the last of his pistol ammunition before resorting to a bloodied saber. Then, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the impossible happened. The relentless Tatar pressure began to slacken. Attacks became sporadic rather than coordinated. The arrow barrage thinned, then stopped entirely. From his position at the northern wall, Zhaboklicki watched in disbelief as Tatar units began to withdraw, first in small groups, then in larger formations. "They're pulling back," he rasped to Bułajowski, who stood beside him, his own disbelief evident. Neither man dared voice what seemed unthinkable, that 400 Polish cavalrymen had somehow withstood the full might of the Crimean horde. As darkness enveloped the battlefield completely, the sounds of the Tatar withdrawal became unmistakable. The jingle of harnesses, the muffled commands of officers, horses moving at a trot rather than a charge. By midnight, the fields around Hodów stood empty save for the dead, the Khan's massive force having melted back into the steppe from which it had emerged. Dawn broke over Hodów with an eerie silence. The defenders, who had spent the night in tense vigilance expecting the Tatars to return, finally allowed themselves to believe in their survival. Outside the stockade, the true scale of their achievement became visible. The ground littered with Tatar dead, discarded weapons, and the debris of battle stretching in all directions. Of the 400 Polish cavalrymen who had ridden into Hodów the previous day, only 270 remained standing. 83 had paid the ultimate price, with the rest wounded to varying degrees. Against this, they had inflicted nearly 2,000 casualties upon Khan Selim's force, a ratio that defied military logic. As Zahorowski led his exhausted men in a prayer of thanksgiving, a distant horn announced the arrival of reinforcements from Okupi Świętej Trójcy, a day too late for the battle, but in time to secure their victory. Word of the impossible stand spread through Poland like wildfire. When the survivors finally returned to Lwów weeks later, crowds lined the streets to witness their passage. King Augustus II, recognizing both the military significance and symbolic power of Hodów, ordered the minting of a special commemorative medal, the Mały Page, small shield, to be awarded to each survivor. On its face, it bore the image of a wall with defenders and the Latin inscription Fidelitat et Constantia, with fidelity and constancy. Zahorowski, Jaboklitsky, and Bułajowski received personal commendations, their names entering the pantheon of Polish military heroes. More significantly, Khan Selim's grand raid had been blunted. The Tatar force withdrew from Polish territory without achieving its strategic objectives, sparing countless civilians from capture and death. The impossible mathematics of Hodów, 400 against 40,000, entered military lore as proof that courage and tactical brilliance could sometimes overcome even the most overwhelming odds. The wooden stockade where Polish determination had turned back the tide was later replaced with a stone monument that still stands today, a silent witness to one of history's most lopsided victories.